The topic I'm refuting is about the minimum wage. The main claim that my opponent proposed was that an increase in the minimum wage will have a negative effect on the economy. I'm here today to show you that how my opponent has failed to prove his position. My opponent supports his proposition with three supporting claims, and that being the minimum wage increase will cause job loss. The second being an increase in minimum wage would cause inflation. And the third being that there will be more competition for jobs. My opponent's first supporting claim was that the minimum wage increase will cause job loss. He supports this secondary claim with three supporting reasons, and those being if labor goes up in price, machines may replace workers. The second being less workers will be hired and some will be laid off. And the third being for each $1 increase in the minimum wage, an employer must pay $1.07 due to the Social Security taxes. Now, the first problem with this whole secondary claim was that a lot of the sources were miscited. For example, the first one being, if labor goes up in price, machines will replace workers. And I could not find a source about how machines will replace workers. My opponent goes on to claim that machines will replace 70% of the workers by the end of the century. And I can't find any sources about that. Also, the advocate fails to explain in depth why an increase in minimum wage will cause workers to be replaced by machines. The second supporting claim fails to support his first secondary claim, was that less workers will be hired and some will be laid off. My opponent says that according to the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, estimated that Obama's proposed $10.10 wage is fully implemented, it will reduce total employment by 500,000 workers. The source he cited, which is actually a federal budget department, it has received criticism from the White House Office of Management and Budget Director about inaccuracies. So I challenge this claim and say that since what I found to be a more reliable source was that according to Doug Hall and David Cooper, founder and senior analysts of the Economic Analysis and Research Network, raising the federal minimum wage will not cause job loss, and it might even boost the economy. The third supporting point that my opponent makes to support the first secondary claim was that for each $1 increase in the minimum wage, an employer must pay $1.07 due to the Social Security taxes. And I could not find any source about this, so that just goes on to further weaken the first secondary claim. Now, the second claim that my opponent made was that an increase in minimum wage will cause inflation. And yes, inflation is happening all the time, but my opponent fails to go in depth and explain inflation. My opponent claims that an increase in minimum wage will cause inflation, that skilled workers will demand higher wages, food will cost more, and the housing and cost of living will go up. And yes, this is true. However, according to the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, an increase in wages is not the only cause to inflation. There are other reasons like market demand and raw material costs, and inflation itself is a tricky number. The number itself is not a bad thing as long as it's in the right ranges. According to Khan Academy, a moderate amount of inflation is good for the economy as long as it coincides with the increase in the money supply. And the third secondary claim that my opponent made was that there will be more competition for jobs. He states that since there are idle workers, they may compete for higher minimum wage jobs and bump many of the lower income workers out. And I challenge this claim by saying, because according to the National Council of Aging, they did a survey in 2015, the median weekly earnings for people who belong to the older age groups of 55 and up had a median weekly salary of $1,069 for men and $781 for women. After doing the math, this comes out to about $26 an hour for men and $20 for women. So that is well above the minimum wage. So the older people who will force out the many lower income workers is false, because most of them are in much higher paying jobs. And there were also no sources to support this claim. This was just like all based on reasoning, and my opponent fails to go in depth about that. So with that, my opponent claimed that an increase in minimum wage will have a negative effect on the economy, and I came here today to prove that, to show you how my opponent has failed to prove his argument. And that was being, he did not cite proper sources for his first secondary claim. He didn't go in depth and explain the second secondary claim, and the third secondary claim lacked any sources and required a lot more explaining. And thank you.
Okay, you label the claims pretty clearly at the beginning. The harms are outlined adequately. There's a signpost on the first point you get there. There's a summary of what the supporting points are. This is getting really well organized, but you've got to be careful that you don't overdo it. And I think that that's one of the things that happens, is that you get caught a little bit in the minutia. Be careful about getting tied up. It might be appropriate to group some of the claims that the advocate is presenting. The main argument that you have on the first point is that the sources are either not correctly cited or there was no source cited. That's a reasonable press to make. But sometimes the way you say it is, I couldn't find any evidence that suggested that. So I'm not sure if that means that the advocate didn't provide a source citation, or when you went out to look for information on this, you couldn't find any information on this. And those are vastly different things. So you got to be careful about how you state that argument. The issue about layoffs and job losses is challenged by attacking the CBO's accuracy, because the White House disagreed with the CBO's assessment. That's a reasonable press to make, but I don't know why you think that the other source that you cite is better qualified than the CBO. That's an awfully big assumption that you're presenting there, and you need to be careful about that. On the next point, the label's clear. Once again, you're saying that no sources were provided. This one you're a little bit clearer at in saying that the advocate failed to provide their sources. On the inflation issue, you tried to diminish the importance of that argument. That's okay. You seem to acknowledge that inflation is going to occur, but you suggest that it's not that important, and as long as it occurs within a reasonable range, that's beneficial. What we need to know is, well, what was the advocate's claim about how much inflation would be created, and does that fall into that reasonable range? That as long as we've got that information, your argument is applicable, but that gets left out of the discussion. And then on the jobs competition argument, you get involved in this discussion of the wages of workers that are over 55, and I'm not sure that that's the group that the advocate was talking about competing with the other workers. Those are probably a different skill level that we're talking about. I can kind of see how you're trying to apply it, although at first it made no sense to me at all when you were presenting it. I didn't know what the heck you were saying. And then as you got further into the argument, I understood the point that you were saying. This is, they're so far away from this, they're not going to be wanting to compete with those particular jobs. I I don't think those are the people that are going to be competing for the jobs. I think you've got the wrong group that the advocate was talking about there. So, you know, that it's a reasonable press again, but it needs to be clear, and I think you need to have some other information to back that up. Oh, there was an argument at one point about automation kinds of things, and I thought that, you know, that the reason why that would be the case was relatively self-evident. You pressed because there's a lack of specific source on that. If you could, for instance, show that human labor would continue to be a reasonable financial alternative, even at the prices that the minimum wage is going to produce, that would, I think, be a stronger argument on that point. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Jacob.